This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
I don't know who told us this story, but they were speaking with the quality manager at the glass plant, and they're like, well, we've had a lot of issues with complaints about split finishes, and they're like, well, you should be sorting those all out in your pasteurizer, and they're like, we don't have a pasteurizer, which was kind of a aha moment.
That's Ben Bailey. He's the quality manager at Troegs Brewing Company. This week on the show, we're going to hear from Ben and 2 others who've got an extremely important message for all craft brewers who put their beer into bottles. We're here today to talk about what I think was one of the most important posters presented during the 2018 Brewing Summit. Like a lot of good things that come out of our industry, this was a collaborative effort that involved several breweries. This crew is here to give you the tools you need to defend your brewery from what is arguably the greatest threat to your brand. Ben, what is the threat, and are we being dramatic, or is this really a big deal?
It is a big deal. We know that beer is a inherently safe product as far as pathogens are concerned. So one of the few ways that you can actually harm a consumer is by having them ingest glass shards, which sounds as bad as it is.
We've also got my pal Shawn Theriot on the line. He's the quality assurance manager over at Deschutes in Bend, Oregon. Shawn, I know you've done a lot of work with the Master Brewers Food Safety Committee, including some instruction during the HACCP course. Please correct me if I've got it wrong, but from what I can tell, glass shards in a bottle is one of the few things that actually ends up becoming a critical control point for those breweries who've implemented a HACCP plan.
That is correct. I know just from the experience that we've had here at Deschutes Brewery, the fragment flush program that we have is a critical control point to make sure that that system is working as we have designed it to, and we're getting the reject pattern, which I'm sure Ben will talk about here in a second, to make sure that that's working fine, because it was an issue for us that was identified in the hazard analysis.
Okay, so what actually causes a bottle to burst in a filler, and just how often does that happen at your brewery?
Here at Troegs, we have a limit set with our glass supplier as far as how often that can actually occur. If it exceeds that, then we'll stop running the glass. But an occasional burst bottle is somewhat expected. So you may get, 4 a day, 5 a day when we're running well. So that's pretty normal. Okay,
and talk about the cost.
There's a lot of stresses that the bottle undergoes when it comes into the filler. There's the pressure of the bottle being pressed up against the seal. If you have a double pre-evac filler, then it's being put under both pressure and vacuum, which can break a bottle that has any weak points. The filling of the beer in there gives it some thermal shock. All of those things are stresses that if there's a weak point in the bottle, it can blow up.
Okay. Tim, Shawn, how about you guys? How often do you guys encounter burst bottles on a daily basis?
I'd say it depends on the day.
You might recognize that voice as Tim Lozen from episode 85. the lactic acid bacteria case study at Bell's?
I would say we average probably about 4 to 6 a week, so not terribly common, but we also have an EBI, so an empty bottle inspection machine that kicks out a lot of glass with particularly sidewall defects, which are relatively easy to find for machines like that, and also I think are the most likely to cause burst bottles in a filler like that.
Yeah, I think our numbers are close to what Tim just mentioned. We recently switched production plants, and our plant that we were pulling from, it was a heavy user of recycled glass. So most of our glass issues were things called stones, which are either pieces of the internal workings of the tank or actual glass that's, like Pyrex glass that's not made to be recyclable, or metal fragments getting into the bottle stream and create what they call a stone, which is a weak spot in the glass. So we would get quite a few of those. Our EBI was pretty good at getting most of them out, but there's a few areas of the bottle that are very hard even for an EBI to detect. So once those glass defects come through, they just tend to pop on your filler, or more appropriately, they tend to explode on the filler.
We could probably spend a whole podcast just on glass bottle defects and all that, but I thought it might be interesting. Does anybody want to describe a bird swing? Because I think that's one of the more interesting ones that can clearly is a high risk for glass shards in the bottle.
Well, it's a piece of glass that runs from one sidewall of the bottle to the other, kind of like the Tweety bird swing in a bird cage. The risk is because it's a filament of glass from one side of the bottle to the other. If the fill tube itself, if you have a long tube filler, doesn't actually break it physically, then the filling of the beer itself can break that glass too, because it's so thin. Then you have already broken glass inside the bottle. There's no way to get around it. It's a huge deal. You stop everything if you see one.
Yeah. How about anybody want to talk about some of the weirdest glass issues you've encountered in a brewery? I'm sure you guys have seen some weird stuff.
Yeah, I think you'll see just about everything coming in. If you look at it long enough, we'll see things like super thin sidewalls are huge issues, stones like we were talking about before. Luckily for us with the EBI, nothing terribly crazy gets to the filler that I know of, at least.
Yeah, we have a whole cabinet full of what we call Misfit Bottles that have either parts of the bottle manufacturing plant that have fallen in there, whether it's melted temperature probes that have, so you've got a piece of metal that looks like a BB in it, or ceramic from the furnace that is broken off into a stone, just all sorts of stuff.
Our EBI one time took an awesome portrait of a fly inside of a bottle, so that was pretty interesting to see.
Nice. All right. Well, some of the new high-tech bottle fillers come with burst bottle detection. Talk about how that works.
On the majority of them, it's just a simple proximity switch on the inlet and the outlet of the filler. So as the bottle comes in, it pushes the centering bell up, and the proximity switch sees that the centering bell is in the raised position, so it knows that there's a bottle in that filler position. And then on the opposite side of the filler, so on the exit of the filler, there's another centering bell proximity switch to see if it's still in the raised position. If the bottle bursts somewhere in between, then the centering bell falls, and the second proximity switch will tell you that the bottle's no longer there. But we also run into an issue where our first proximity switch was damaged, and so it didn't detect anything, and so it didn't know when bottles had burst. So that stuff has to be checked out on a regular basis to confirm that it's actually functioning.
What kind of regular basis? Are you guys doing that like at startup every time, or is that sort of like a weekly or monthly thing, or what?
Well, now we have a burst bottle log sheet to record every instance. And so if the burst bottle rinse program doesn't engage after a burst bottle occurs, I mean, they're loud, when it happens. If the filler doesn't go into that rinse phase and do all the low fills, then
it didn't
stop
work.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So we don't have to do it as an extra thing. It's just a matter of paying attention.
Got it. Okay, great. And we'll talk about that log process here in a bit. A lot of fillers with burst bottle detection have that automatic rinsing that you just talked about. How reliable is that rinse process?
I think the rinse process is pretty reliable. It's just a matter of each filler is unique, and there may be a weak point that the rinser can't hit. So, especially if you're looking at ledges or if there's soft gasket material where the glass gets embedded, there's no rinser that can pull it out of that. You're going to have to change the gasket out. So I guess they're reliable. It's just sometimes there's situations where they're ineffective.
Yeah, it's not like you're using a garden hose to spray off those gaskets.
Right.
I can tell you that we don't have a rinser for our program, and so we also don't know always what valve the broken bottle came from. So I could tell you, aside from a safety piece, it's also a huge quality piece because we will do valve samples for our TPO tests, and often we'll find some very high numbers on a certain valve. We'll retest it a couple times, those numbers stay high, and then when we go in to replace the centering bell, we might find a shard of glass in there. So, we're lucky that it didn't go into another bottle, and we get it out of there as quickly as possible.
Shawn, you got any comments on, do you guys remove the gasket from the centering bell after a burst?
Yeah, I think what we were talking about earlier before this podcast with Ben and Tim was how sometimes, ignorance is bliss. So we functioned for years without stopping the filler and looking at the gaskets. And during rebuilds, we would see all these nicks in the gasket. And we're like, oh, that's weird, Wonder what that's about. And then the one day we've actually found a piece of glass lodged in there. And then once you see something like that, with HACCP, once you know that there's a potential for something to reasonably get lodged in there, you really need to address it. So after that point, we decided that we could tell which valve was bursting. So we actually stopped the filler every time on that valve and at least visually inspect it. And we have valves, gaskets ready to go that are already pre-sanitized, and we just swap them out if there's any doubt about whether or not glass has embedded itself in there.
Talk about the importance of rejecting bottles immediately adjacent to the bottle that burst. Some brewers will say, well, why would I do that? Those bottles were sealed against the filler when the other bottle exploded, so there's no glass in them.
Yeah, that was a surprise to us, to be honest. When we started this work group, Rob Frazier, who worked at Sierra Nevada at the time, had a very robust burst bottle program at their brewery, and they had found that that's a possibility. So when we started doing our validation, we saw that was a fact, that we definitely saw glass in those adjacent bottles. And when we talked to our filler manufacturer, they disagreed that it was possible, even though we'd found the glass in there on the filter paper. So we knew it was in there.
And again, the reason that's possible is because that those bottles, even though they were sealed at the time of the burst, as they're exiting the filler, then glass that's hung up on those gaskets or anywhere really could fall down into the bottle, right? Is that where it's coming from?
Yeah, that's our assumption. I mean, it has to be falling into the bottle because the common conception up till now was that it can't get in there because it's sealed. Well, that's certainly true, but once it drops off that centering bell, it's no longer sealed. And if there was glass on top of the centering bell or maybe up on top of the valve, it could be anywhere, but it's then able to fall into the bottle once it comes off of the seal before it goes into the crowner.
Your poster has some crafty solutions to rejecting these already full bottles on automated lines. Talk about those.
What we ended up doing was we have a good programmer here at Trogs who is able to get in there and change the program to skip the sniff step, which then causes the bottle to geyser as soon as it comes out of the filler, which creates a low fill. Another option, if you have the ability, is to stop the crowner from crowning those bottles, because we don't have a filler that talks to the rejection system. So we have to create a rejectable bottle. If it's filled and crowned properly, then the inspector does not know why it would need to be rejected. They would have to create a a bad bottle for it to reject. But I'll also say that's for a higher speed line. I mean, ours isn't extremely high speed, but if you've got a slower line, you may be able to just manually jump in there. You see where the bottle's missing out of the outfeed because there's a space there where there's nothing coming out. And if you grab the ones on each side by hand, that would work too. Ours is a little too fast to be able to pull that off, but for smaller lines, that's certainly an option.
What about smaller machines that don't have burst bottle detection? What do they do?
Well, we'll get into the validation points a little bit later, but the main thing is to just look at what you've got. So see if you're getting glass in those bottles. And then, I mean, you can do all this manually. If you've got a manual filler and you'll notice a burst bottle, then you'd stop, clean up the filler, and then confirm that the way you've cleaned it is sufficient to ensure that there's no glass getting into any of the other bottles.
Okay.
So it could be a super manual garden hose operation. It just needs to be done and thought about.
Coming up.
We found huge holes in our procedure, which we would not have identified had we not tried to validate the process by collecting all the bottles and filtering them.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas.
This Master Brewers Podcast is proudly sponsored by Barna Mechanical, a full-service design build firm specializing in turnkey process and utility systems for the brewing industry. We partner with some of the best craft brewers in the U.S. to ensure the great beer they brew is what their customers get in every glass, bottle, can, or keg. You know beer. We know breweries.
Additional support provided by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
There's only a few things left on the Master Brewers calendar for 2018. November wraps up with a webinar on strategies and tactics for being inclusive and building diversity in craft beer. The annual District St. Louis holiday party is December 7th. Also on December 7th, you can catch the webinar on beverage can production. And it's not too early to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. I can't wait to see what decorations Tressa comes up with. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. I guess I wasn't planning on doing this, but I think maybe, does it make sense for everybody to describe their mitigation procedure rather than us trying to just give an example one? You want to do that?
Sure.
All right. Go ahead.
So here at Bell's, what we do is our filler does have burst bottle detection, and then we have a Hoist low fill detection system that sits right outside the filler. And so what will happen is we will reject 13 bottles. So on the first rotation, we'll reject 2 on each side. And the second rotation, we'll do the burst bottle plus another 2 on each side. And then on the third rotation, we'll do the burst on 1 on each side. After that, all those bottles will get half filled, so they get rejected out by the Hoist. We collect those, and then we will dump the bottles out through a little stainless sieve. We'll rinse the bottles out pretty well, dump them back through there, and then we'll record where the glass came from. And if we can organize ourselves well enough, like exactly what bottle it came from, so we know where in proximity to the burst bottle that shard of glass was found. I would say that we also find glass maybe not even half the time. And when we do find it, it usually is, like we were just talking about, in a bottle adjacent to where the burst bottle was. So kind of what we expect. So we collect all the bottles, we'll rinse and filter them out, and then we'll record the time of day that it happened, what we were running that day. So that way, if we do happen to get a complaint from a consumer, we can go back and check our records to see if we did have any burst bottles at that time, or if it might have come from a different source.
Ben, what do you guys do?
Well, the first thing that has to happen is that the filler has to know that there's a burst bottle. Once that's happened, in our filler, we have that underfill the adjacent bottles and empty the filler. So the in-feed bottle stop is engaged, and it will low fill the bottles, 4 filler valves on each side of the valve where the burst occurred. And once the glass is out of the filler, so it'll regularly fill the bottles like on the opposite side where there's no chance of glass getting in it. Then we get in there and pull out the centering bell gasket. We'll inspect it, but just to keep moving as fast as possible instead of having them try to determine whether it's clean or not. It's just faster for us to pull it out, put in a sanitized gasket that we have ready, and then keep moving, and then they can inspect that gasket after they get back up and running and see if there's any glass that needs to be removed. Then once the glass after the gasket's been removed, we have the rinsers come on, which rinse the filler valves back off. And then after that, if there weren't enough bottles to finish the 5 revolutions after the burst bottle, then it will continue to low fill those bottles to complete that cycle.
Shawn, you're up.
Here at Deschutes, we do something similar to where when we have a burst bottle, the first thing that happens is the incoming bottles coming into the filler get stopped. Some sprayers come on, so we're getting a rinse. And what we try to have is at least 2 revolutions of the filler rinsing without any bottles present. So immediately we go into our pattern while there are bottles present, which is 4 rotations of plus or minus 2 around the burst bottle. And then we do the burst bottle location after we go through those 4 revolutions. We do the burst bottle location where we reject the burst bottle twice. The valve where the burst occurred, we'll reject that one twice. Similar to Ben, somewhere in the middle of that pattern, we run out of glass, and then we do the rinse and we check the gasket. And then once glass comes back in, we resume the pattern. We also do a validation run at least 25 times a year where we expand that pattern. We basically add another bottle on either side to our normal reject pattern. And what we're trying to do is make sure we don't find glass on the edges of our pattern. Because if we find glass on the edges of our pattern, then the question comes into our head, well, maybe we should be doing plus or minus 4 to make sure that we never get glass on the edge of that reject pattern. We do that 25 times a year where we filter every bottle.
I've definitely worked in some breweries that had some sort of policy for discarding some number of bottles after a burst, but then there was no validation step. So let's talk about how you do validate the plan to ensure the intended results.
Well, I will start by saying the validation step is probably one of the most critical points of this whole process, because we definitely found huge holes in our procedure, which we would not have identified had we not tried to validate the process by collecting all the bottles and filtering them, which is basically all you do for validation. You take all the bottles you can from burst bottle occurrence that are directly adjacent to it and on subsequent revolutions, and filter all of those bottles through filter paper. We use the same 0.45 micron membranes that we do for microbiological testing and filter it through those. If you're running turbid beers, you probably need to pick something with a larger pore size. But if it's filtered beer, we can pull that off. Then we look at the filter paper under a microscope to see if we find any glass. And usually we don't really even need to look at it that close. You can see the shards easier than that, but we just want to make sure there's no tiny micro shards somewhere. And then at some frequency, like say twice a year, you would want to make sure that everything's working right and that things haven't changed somehow in the filler to where your pattern needs to be expanded, or that the procedure you're following is still sufficient.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the most critical things, that if a brewery is going to come up with an effective burst bottle program, that's one of the most important pieces, because we could sit here and listeners could take what we're saying and copy it for their brewery, but everybody's line's different. Everybody's line's got its own areas that could cause glass to travel into other bottles, so you really need to do the homework yourself.
Shawn, you mentioned that you guys do the expanded validation 25 times a year, but how often are you doing just the normal validation?
We set a goal for 100 audits per year, which means the burst pattern. 25 of those are the expanded one, and 75 are our normal pattern. So we feel, with verifying that the normal pattern's happening and validating that the 25 with the expanded pattern aren't finding any glass, we feel good about it. And I will say that we've changed our pattern several times over the years because of things we found during those audits, where we thought that, okay, wow, we really need to go another revolution here. 4 is not good enough, so we went to 5. And we certainly did that when we got a new bottle line in. So we had an old bottle line with a burst pattern here at Deschutes, switched over to the new one and realized, okay, well, this one, there's a little more rinsing capability of our new filler around the outside of it. So we were actually able to cut that back on the number of bottles that we discarded, but we validated that with the expanded burst pattern.
Ben touched on this a little bit, having a log where you record the date and time of the burst and all that, but let's talk about, maybe highlight the importance of that, because that's a very basic step that really, frankly, there's no excuse to not do, right?
Yeah, I think we're all keeping logs of things. In the poster itself, there's a really nice example of a form laid out. So it puts out all the bottles where the burst bottle is, and then all the other bottles in proximity to that. And you can literally just check off what bottle you find any debris in. I think that's something super simple that people could use. You just record date, time, the batch ID. Pretty easy process.
Great.
Yeah, we keep a log for. Also, in addition to that validation log that's in the poster, we just have one that's out on the floor where they write down the time and the valve number that a burst occurred. And we actually report some of that data, I think I said earlier, but back to our glass manufacturer. So if there's a spike in occurrences, then they can look at their equipment as well and tighten up their procedures so we don't get as much of the glass that's going to cause problems in the first place.
And I'm sure that goes a long way too, because when you're working directly with the supplier, it's one thing to pick up the phone and say, hey, we're getting a bunch of bursts all of a sudden, and it's another thing to provide them with some data and say, here's how many we used to get and here's how many we have now.
That's correct. We send them a chart every month with that all graphed out so that they're aware of where they're trending.
Shawn, sound like you had something you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to emphasize what both of you gentlemen have just said, that aside from the obvious food safety part of this program, just having that reject rate, and a reject rate even more powerful is if you have that tied to a lot of glass and communicate that back to your supplier. It adds a lot of support to what you're trying to tell them.
I was going to say, Ben mentioned before the Misfit glass collection. I think on top of that, saving these glass samples really helps the suppliers as well. And, it lets people know they're good training pieces to put out on the floor, just to let people know what can and will happen from time to time with glass quality.
All right. So we didn't really talk about it yet. I wanted to ask, find out how all this got started. What facilitated you all coming together on this important issue?
So back in 2013, there was an offshoot of the ASBC quality subcommittee. The quality subcommittee with the ASBC kept talking about glass issues, and the American Society of Brewing Chemists, glass really doesn't fall underneath their under their main focus. So a couple breweries got together and said, hey, maybe there's some need for this out in the field. So a lot of craft brewers came together. We started talking about glass quality. So we're the Craft Brewers Glass Quality Group. Started with, breweries such as Sierra Nevada, Trogs, Bell's, Deschutes, Real Ale down in Texas. We're up to 75 members now, and these are one of the things that we talk about. And we identified a couple top projects to work on as a team, and the burst bottle program was clearly right toward the top. As you mentioned earlier, John, for a lot of people's HACCP plans, it will be the critical control point for an entire brewery. We've centered around craft brewers because back when we started this in 2013, so we're almost 5 years old to the date. Craft brewers really didn't have a lot of folks that had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to deal with some of these intense glass critical issues. So, critical issues find their way into craft breweries just like bigger breweries. The one thing that most craft breweries have as a challenge is that we're not pasteurizing our beer. So a lot of the bottles that break are bottles that we're filling to send out to customers. The pasteurizer definitely has a way to expose weak glass. So the need was there. Folks came together. Definitely a plug for anybody who's interested in bringing their glass program to the next level. Email me or email anybody on this phone call, and you can partake in it as well. We've designed a stock AQL, acceptable quality limits document that folks can use. We have a best practice document for breweries, which details a lot of glass defects that you can find. And we also have the work that Ben and Tim and Kathy down at Real Ale in Texas have come together with this burst bottle program. So we have these documents. This podcast is one of the ways that we're trying to reach out to other breweries and kind of let them know that this is something that you should be looking at. But by all means, if you have an interest, reach out to us and we can include you on that list so you have access to those documents. We've also done workshops. So if you attend MBAA meetings, we've done glass quality workshops, a couple poster presentations, and something that I'm really proud that the group did, if I can keep plugging the group, John.
Go for it.
We did and Ben was instrumental in this. We actually hired a team from American Glass Research to train our members on supplier audits and defect training or defect identification with the American Glass Research, which is a third party that excels in auditing glass plants and training folks. So we did that at Mills River at the Sierra Nevada Brewery, and it was very much a collaboration of craft brewers that came together, and over 2.5 days were educated on how to identify defects and audit their glass supplier.
I don't know who told us this story, but they were speaking with the quality manager at the glass plant, and they're like, well, we've had a lot of issues with complaints about split finishes. And they're like, well, you should be sorting those all out in your pasteurizer. And they're like, we don't have a pasteurizer, which was kind of a aha moment of, okay, there needs to be a group that actually tells the glass plants about the special needs that craft brewers have, which I didn't think we had special needs before that, but yeah, the lack of a tunnel pasteurizer is a big difference between the breweries they've been dealing with for years and years.
Do you want to explain what a split finish is to those who may not know?
It's basically like a crack in the mouth of the bottle is a way to explain it. So the beer could leak out or it could just go flat and the bottle's intact. So oftentimes when we get those complaints, they just say it's a flat beer. And then if we get the bottle back, then
you can
99% of the time, you'll see it. You have to look really close and know what you're looking for, but it's just a tiny crack, for lack of a better description.
was Ben Bailey from Trogs, Tim Lozen from Bell's, and Shawn Theriot from Deschutes. Okay, so now that you know you need to implement a burst bottle program, even if your filler is small and manual, what do you do next? Well, check out the Craft Brewers Glass Quality Group's 2018 Brewing Summit Poster, which includes an example validation procedure. For only $89, you can have access to this poster and all of the other amazing work that was presented at the 2018 Brewing Summit. Master Brewers members get a discount. Go to nbaa.com/store, then click on Conference Proceedings, or look for a link in the show notes.
Like everyone else did. Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Hey, remember the Belgian beer book that Sten Mertens and Jan Stencils talked about on episode 101, The Yeasts of Tomorrow? Well, great news. It's now available in the Master Brewers bookstore. Just go to nbaa.com/store and type Belgian beer into the search bar to get your copy today.
And maybe 3 things that I should have mentioned, but I did. My fist full of courage.
Thank you for calling Deschutes Brewery. This is Julia.
Yes, I'm hoping to speak with Shawn Theriot.
Yeah, hang on just a moment.
Wow, I've never been on this side of it before.
Hello, is this better?
And Shawn, we have, Ben's coming to us from Philly, right? That's the home of what?
I don't know. It's cheesesteaks.
Come on, Shawn.
Oh, the best burger in the world.
That's right. Village Whiskey, right?
That's right.
Ben, is there any way you can convince the Village Whiskey to become a sponsor of the Master Brewers podcast? Because I think Shawn and I would really like to make that happen.
I'll see what I can do. I don't have a whole lot of strings or juice there.
How often would you say you go there?
I haven't been there in a couple of years. It is quite good, though. You're right.
What's wrong with you, man? If I lived there, I would go there. I go there 100% of the time that I'm in Philadelphia. I'll tell you that.
John, maybe we should take a picture of the tattoos that we got after we ate those burgers and send it to them.
Definitely. All right.